Imagine this. It's a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I'm in my garage, halfway through my cup of tea, just enjoying a peaceful moment until I notice a thick black cable snaking across the floor. Curious, I follow it, and what do I find? My neighbor's golf cart is plugged into my outlet, like my garage has suddenly turned into a public EV charging station. I ask her about it, and she shrugs, saying, "Oh, ran out of juice. Your garage was open. Neighbors help neighbors, right?" I tried to stay calm, but her idea of gratitude was showing bolt cutters to my security camera and sticking her tongue out. That's when I knew it was time to get clever. I rigged up a little surprise, a 5-second timer she won't soon forget. Petty? Maybe? Satisfying? Without question. Now, here's the thing. I'm a 35-year-old guy who works from home, and my garage isn't just a garage, it's my sanctuary. I restore old furniture, mess with vintage electronics, and work on temperature-sensitive projects that can't handle sudden power dips. It's my office, my workshop, and my escape all rolled into one, filled with delicate tools and expensive gear that needs stable electricity. I never imagined I'd have to defend it like some kind of power-hungry fortress, and definitely not from a neighbor. But then again, I never expected to meet someone like Beatrix Sterling. Looking back, the red flags were there, but I've always been the quiet, non-confrontational type. I value my peace, my little corner of solitude, and just getting along with the people around me. Until now, looking back, maybe my first real mistake was underestimating her. Beatrix Sterling, 62 years old, radiating full-blown classic Karen energy, the kind that could power her own HOA. She's been in the neighborhood for over a decade and has somehow crowned herself the unofficial queen of the homeowners association. You know the type, always impeccably dressed, always ready with an opinion, and somehow, no matter the topic, it circles back to how much she's done for the community. I still remember our first encounter. She rang my doorbell with a plate of banana bread and a bright smile, immediately asking which HOA subcommittee I'd be joining. At the time, I thought she was being friendly. Yeah, that was mistake number 2, because the woman who handed out warm-baked goods had, over time, morphed into this self-appointed authority figure who acted like the neighborhood was her personal kingdom. I don't even know when that shift happened or if it was always there and I just didn't see it. Fast forward to a crisp, early fall Saturday morning, I'm in my garage with a hot cup of coffee, mentally mapping out my day, feeling good about the progress on a vintage 1960s stereo I'd been restoring. The garage door was open to let in the perfect weather, the kind of morning that makes you feel grounded and grateful. Then, something strange caught my eye. A thick, heavy-duty extension cord stretched across my garage floor. Now I know every single item in that space like the back of my hand, and this cable was definitely not mine. It was industrial grade, the type you'd use for serious machinery, and it was just draped across my workspace like it had every right to be there. My curiosity turned to confusion as I traced it outside, only to find Beatrix's spotless white golf cart sitting boldly in my driveway, plugged right into my exterior power outlet like she had a reserved spot and a lifetime membership to my electricity. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring at the scene in front of me, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing, because honestly, who does that? Who just walks onto someone else's property and plugs their expensive, tricked-out golf cart into a private power outlet without so much as a heads-up? I kept wondering if I was overreacting or if this was as insane as it felt, but deep down, something about it just seemed fundamentally wrong. This wasn't some harmless oversight. It was blatant, like she didn't even consider the possibility that it might not be okay. The cart wasn't some rundown beater either. It was top of the line, the kind of sleek model you see coasting around high-end resort communities. And there it was, quietly siphoning electricity from my home, like I was some kind of utility provider she didn't need to pay. The whole moment felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into a reality where boundaries meant nothing and basic respect. For personal property had vanished. I walked back into my garage, pacing a bit, unsure how to respond. I've never been one for confrontation. It makes me uneasy, always has, but ignoring this wasn't an option. So I took a deep breath, mustered whatever assertiveness I could, and made my way to Beatrice's front door. She answered almost instantly, dressed like she was headed to a brunch at the country club, her smile bright and effortless, as if we were lifelong friends casually catching up. "Oh, hi there," she said with a chipper tone, completely unfazed. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" And all I could think was, are we seriously going to pretend your golf cart isn't plugged into my garage right now, like that's just a normal Saturday morning activity? I wanted to just walk away and avoid the awkwardness, but that carefully curated smile of hers made it impossible. So I kept things light and said, "Hey, Beatrice, I noticed your golf cart is plugged into my outlet. Is everything okay?" Trying to sound casual, even though every part of me wanted to scream, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And this is where things took a turn from mildly annoying to downright unbelievable, because instead of looking even remotely embarrassed or offering any kind of apology, she just gave this casual wave of her hand and launched into an explanation, like she was doing me a favor. "My car died on me during my morning ride," she said breezily. "I saw your garage door open, so I just plugged in. No big deal." The way she said it so matter-of-fact, like it was the most normal, everyday thing in the world, made it clear she didn't see anything wrong with what she'd done. In fact, it was almost like she expected me to thank her for not bothering to knock. I stood there, speechless, unsure how to even respond to that kind of entitled logic. A part of me wanted to just walk away and pretend it never happened, but her tone, so casual, so dismissive, really got under my skin. There was this unspoken assumption in her voice, like my property was hers to use whenever it suited her needs. So I tried to stay calm and said, "Oh, well, could you maybe ask me first next time?" Thinking that was a perfectly reasonable request. I mean, it's basic decency, right? But instead of nodding or apologizing, her expression shifted to pure annoyance, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Ask? Come on, we're neighbors," she said, like that explained everything. "Besides, I'm on the HOA board. I know what's community friendly." And just like that, she dropped the first reference to her precious HOA title, like it somehow gave her special privileges over everyone else. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to that moment, to what she was really implying, but at the time, I was still trying to handle things politely, trying to diffuse the situation without causing a scene. "But this is still my private property," I began, trying to calmly explain the boundaries, but she cut me off mid-sentence with a laugh sharp, clipped, and laced with condescension. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It had this mocking edge, like she genuinely thought I was ridiculous for even bringing up the concept of personal ownership. "Don't be," she started, and I could already tell whatever came next wasn't going to make things any better. "So uptight about it. It's just a little electricity. What's the harm?" she said, her tone dripping with that same smug dismissiveness that had been woven through the whole conversation. The way she emphasized uptight made it clear that, in her mind, I was the unreasonable one here standing in my own driveway, being subtly scolded for having the audacity to care about who used my power and how. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but not being one for conflict, I just nodded, mumbled something vaguely agreeable, and hoped that would be the end of it. She turned and walked back to her house with a self-satisfied smile, like she'd just taught me a valuable lesson in neighborhood diplomacy. And all I could do was stand there with a sinking feeling in my gut. It wasn't just that she'd used my outlet without asking, it was the attitude, the assumption that my property was available on demand, the implication that her status on the HOA board somehow gave her a pass to override basic respect. I had a bad feeling this wasn't a one-time emergency, but the beginning of a much bigger boundary issue. She had made it clear she didn't think rules or even common courtesy applied to her, and now that she'd tested the line and gotten away with it, I knew it wouldn't stop there. Still, ever the optimist, I told myself maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she really had just acted out of necessity and would respect the boundary moving forward. But deep down, I think I knew better. As I watched her golf cart disappear around the corner later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that my polite response had just signaled open season on my patience. So I decided to handle it like a reasonable adult, no drama, no confrontation, just a calm, clear step toward setting boundaries. I wasn't trying to start a feud. I wasn't looking to escalate anything. I just wanted a simple, respectful understanding that this was my space, my power, my garage, and it wasn't up for communal use just because someone didn't feel like walking back to their own house. Boy, was I ever wrong about that. Thinking I could handle this with quiet reason and a little preventive action, I headed to the hardware store and picked up a heavy-duty padlock for my outdoor outlet cover, along with a small but unmistakable private property sign just to make everything as clear and polite as possible. I figured, surely any normal person would see the lock and the sign, realize they'd crossed a line, and either ask next time or, better yet, find another solution altogether. Problem solved, right? Turns out I was being incredibly naive. Was I overreacting? Maybe just a little. Or maybe I'd simply never dealt with someone who viewed rules as optional decorations, nice to look at, but ultimately ignorable. On top of that, I decided it was finally time to install a basic security camera system around the garage. Nothing over the top or invasive, just a small, weather-resistant camera connected to my phone so I could monitor things in real time. I'd been considering it anyway, what with the rise in package thefts lately, and this whole incident seemed like the perfect excuse to pull the trigger. I mounted the camera discreetly, angled it to cover the garage area and the power outlet, and felt a small wave of satisfaction, finally taking some control of the situation without escalating it. Honestly, I expected the footage to be nothing more than squirrels, blowing leaves, or maybe the occasional wandering raccoon. The setup took me about an hour, and I was proud of how I'd handled things. Calm, thoughtful, no confrontation, just clear boundaries. For 2 whole days, everything was quiet. Nothing happened. The lock stayed untouched, the camera showed only the usual suburban wildlife, and I started thinking maybe, just maybe, Beatrice had gotten the message. Maybe the lock and the sign had been enough to establish the boundary without ruffling any feathers. I even started to feel a little guilty, wondering if I'd misjudged her, if I jumped to conclusions. Maybe she really had just needed a quick charge that day. Maybe she was a little overconfident, but ultimately harmless. For a brief, peaceful moment, I actually believed I'd handled the whole thing perfectly, firm but fair, clear but respectful. Maybe she really had just needed help in an emergency, and now that I'd set a clear boundary, we could move forward as normal neighbors again. I was actually proud of how maturely I'd handled everything. No yelling, no drama, just quiet action and respectful limits. Looking back now, I can't believe how completely wrong I was about what was coming next. Those 2 quiet days weren't Beatrice respecting my boundaries, they were her plotting her next move. Day 3 flipped everything upside down. I was sitting at my desk during my lunch break, scrolling through my phone without much purpose, when I decided to check the security camera app, just a casual glance, not expecting anything. But what I saw on that screen made my stomach drop. I had to rewind the footage 3 times before I could even process what I was seeing. There was Beatrice, standing confidently in front of my garage, holding a pair of massive industrial-strength bolt cutters, not the kind you pick up on. A whim, but the serious kind designed to slice through thick, hardened metal. And she was using them slowly, deliberately cutting through my new outlet lock with all the calmness of someone pruning roses. No hesitation, no concern, just cool focus like it was an everyday chore on her checklist. My hands went numb and I actually dropped my phone. It felt like I was watching the climax of a suspense film, except the villain was standing in my driveway, casually committing what was basically vandalism like she had every right to be there. But what truly sent chills down my spine was what happened next. After she snapped through the lock like it was nothing, she turned and looked directly into the security camera. Not surprised, not guilty, just completely unfazed. And then, I'm not even kidding, she gave this slow, knowing smile, raised her hand, and stuck her tongue out. A full-on, deliberate, bratty tongue-out gesture, like a defiant child caught stealing cookies. Except this wasn't some harmless prank, this was a grown woman, trespassing and destroying my property, staring straight into the lens like she wanted me to see every second of it, like she'd just gotten away with something, standing there on my driveway with a kind of smug satisfaction that took my breath away. The sheer audacity of it all, this 62-year-old woman who had just destroyed my property was now openly mocking me through my own security camera like she was proud of it. I honestly didn't know whether to burst out laughing or start screaming. The whole thing was so juvenile, so deliberately disrespectful, that it took a few moments for my brain to catch up with what I just witnessed. And as if that wasn't enough, she casually plugged her golf cart into my now unlocked outlet, like nothing had happened. Just another sunny day, just another battery to charge. She left it there to soak up my electricity while she went about her business, totally unfazed. But the final insult came hours later, when I got home from work and found a small handwritten note tucked under my garage door. I unfolded it and immediately recognized the perfectly neat handwriting. It was from Beatrice. The note read, "Stop creating barriers to community access." This kind of selfish behavior is exactly what's wrong with this neighborhood. Do better BS. And yes, those initials felt painfully accurate on multiple levels. I had to sit down for a moment after reading it just to let the rage settle before I did something I'd regret. She had destroyed my property, laughed in my face via security footage, stolen my electricity, and now she was lecturing me about selfishness? That was the moment I fully realized I wasn't dealing with a confused or misguided neighbor. This was someone living in a completely different reality, one where her needs and whims overruled everyone else's rights, including basic laws and boundaries. I must have watched that footage 5 more times that evening, each replay more surreal than the last, the cold precision of her bolt cutters, the deliberate tongue-out mockery, the casual walk-off like she had nothing to hide, followed by the follow. Self-righteous note blaming me for the fallout. This wasn't entitlement anymore. This was calculated, intentional, like she was enjoying the power trip, pushing buttons just to see how far she could go. There was no misunderstanding, no emergency. Just someone who believed she was above accountability and was daring me to do something about it. She was operating from a place of complete disregard for my rights, wrapped in this unshakable belief that she had some kind of divine authority to do whatever she pleased, and suddenly, my quiet attempt to set reasonable, respectful boundaries had become a personal challenge for her. What really unsettled me was how deliberate it all felt. She hadn't just impulsively acted out, she'd planned this. She'd brought bolt cutters, heavy-duty ones, which meant she had every intention of breaking through that lock. She looked straight into my camera and mocked me with a smug little performance, fully aware I'd be watching. And then she left that condescending note under my garage door, written in perfect cursive like a final insult, convinced she was the righteous one and I was some anti-community villain. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of desperation. It was a full-blown power play by someone who saw my property lines not as boundaries to respect, but as barriers to bulldoze. That's when it hit me. There was no resolving this like normal adults. Beatrice wasn't looking for understanding, compromise, or conversation. She was interested in asserting control, proving to me and maybe even to herself that her will outranked mine. Every step she'd taken was calculated to send a message. Your space, your rules, your effort to protect what's yours, it all means nothing to me. And that night, lying in bed, replaying that absurd, childish tongue-out gesture over and over. In my head, I came to a sobering realization. I wasn't dealing with someone who made an honest mistake or misunderstood boundaries. I was dealing with someone who believed her convenience justified crossing every line, and that anyone who didn't bow to that belief was simply being difficult. Suddenly, her mention of being on the HOA board made perfect sense. This was someone used to wielding control through faux authority and subtle intimidation. But what she probably hadn't counted on was that, while I might avoid conflict by nature, I also have a breaking point, and when I reach it, I don't back down. That ridiculous little gesture at the camera, that was the final straw. As I stared at the footage one last time before going to sleep, I knew it wasn't just about electricity anymore. This had become personal. She had crossed from being a bad neighbor into something much worse, someone who saw herself as above the rules, and I wasn't about to let that stand, and she'd made it crystal clear she had no interest whatsoever in respecting the boundaries I'd tried so patiently to set. Normal approaches, polite conversations, subtle hints, none of it was going to work with someone like Beatrice. I realized I needed to get creative, to shift gears and start thinking like someone who understood that sometimes the only way to deal with fire is to bring your own. What I didn't know then was just how beautifully that bolt cutter stunt of hers was going to backfire. After watching her slice through my lock and mock me on camera like she was starring in her own petty villain origin story, I decided it was time to go official. I had more than enough. Clear video footage of her trespassing and destroying property, repeated unauthorized use of my electricity, and that charming handwritten note that practically oozed entitlement and hostility. Surely the HOA no matter how long she'd been a board member would have to take documented evidence over someone's word. I mean, rules are rules, right? So I spent that entire evening crafting what I believed was the perfect email to the HOA board, professional, calm, and backed by irrefutable proof. It was everything a formal complaint should be: no emotion, no rants, just facts, footage, and a clear, respectful request for mediation. I attached the video of her cutting the lock and sticking her tongue out at the camera, cited specific sections of the HOA bylaws regarding property boundaries and neighbor conduct, and asked for a formal resolution to what I very diplomatically framed as an ongoing misunderstanding between neighbors. I kept the tone neutral and solution-focused, avoided anything that could be seen as accusatory or dramatic, and even ended the email by thanking them for their time and expressing confidence that the issue would be handled fairly. Hitting send, I actually felt a surge of optimism, like maybe finally someone with authority would step in, see this objectively, and put an end to Beatrice's increasingly outrageous behavior. I was proud of myself. I had taken the high road, followed the rules, and used the systems in place. This was how adults solved problems, with evidence, procedure, and a little bit of faith that reason still meant something. 3 days passed without a single response, no confirmation. No, we received your complaint, not even a generic acknowledgement, and I started wondering if my email had gotten lost in a spam folder or buried under other messages. Still, I reminded myself that these things can take time. Maybe they were reviewing the evidence carefully. Maybe legal counsel was involved, especially with the property destruction component. I tried to stay patient, telling myself that fairness sometimes moves slowly. But then, on the fourth day, I received a response and it blindsided me so hard, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. It wasn't what I expected at all. In fact, reading it felt like being gaslit by an entire organization. My eyes kept scanning the same sentence over and over, hoping I had misread it, that the meaning would change if I stared hard enough. But there it was, plain as day. The email from the HOA board president didn't even begin with my name, just a cold, impersonal dear resident, which in hindsight should have been my first red flag. By the second paragraph, the tone shifted sharply. We have received your complaint along with several counter-complaints regarding your hostile and unwelcoming behavior toward a valued community member. Beatrice Sterling has served this HOA faithfully for over 10 years and has consistently demonstrated the kind of community spirit we hope to foster in all our residents. I sat there frozen. Counter-complaints? Several of them? What counter? Complaints? My heart pounded as I tried to process how actual video footage of her destroying my lock and stealing power had been twisted into accusations against me. And it only got worse. The next paragraph accused me of creating barriers to community cooperation and described my installation of security cameras as a troubling pattern of antisocial behavior. My head was spinning. They were framing my security measures as some kind of neighborhood surveillance program. My padlock? A hostile act. My attempt to protect my property? Apparently divisive. I kept thinking about that footage of her grinning at the camera, sticking out her tongue like a smug child who knew she'd get away with it, and now, unbelievably, I was the one getting a formal warning. The final paragraph hit like a hammer. Consider this your formal warning about creating division in our community. We have discussed this matter extensively with Mrs. Sterling, and she has expressed genuine concern about your escalating behavior toward her. Further complaints may result in an HOA conduct review and potential sanctions. We trust you will take this opportunity to reset your approach to neighbor relations and find more constructive ways to address any concerns you may have. I stared at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just dismissing my complaint, they were threatening me. The irony was staggering. I, the person whose property was violated, whose electricity was stolen, who had proof of every incident, was now being warned by the very board I had turned to for help. My carefully worded email had somehow become a weapon against me. Beatrice hadn't just spun the narrative, she'd completely inverted it. She'd painted herself as the victim and me as the aggressor. My security footage had become surveillance of neighbors. My boundary setting had become antisocial behavior. And now, thanks to her influence and seniority on the HOA board, I was officially the one on notice. My attempt to protect my property had been reframed as erecting barriers to community cooperation, and my detailed documentation of her actual crimes had somehow become evidence of my so-called escalating behavior. It was so backwards, so grotesquely flipped from reality, that for a brief moment I genuinely wondered if I was losing my grip. How could footage of someone blatantly destroying my property be used as proof that I was the problem? But the most chilling realization wasn't the board's blind support. It was understanding just how masterfully Beatrice had orchestrated all of it. She hadn't just cut through my lock and mocked me with a smug, childish grin. She'd anticipated the fallout. She'd prepared for the official complaint I was naive enough to think would make a difference. Her decade of H.O.A. service, her polished reputation, Her public displays of neighborly virtue, all of it was armor she'd carefully cultivated to shield herself from accountability. She didn't just twist the narrative, she rewrote the entire rulebook before I even knew we were playing a game. Every move I made to protect myself had already been countered. Every defense I'd built had been turned against me before I even knew I'd need it. That evening, sitting in my garage, the very place this all began, I read the HOA email one more time, and the weight of it fully settled in. The system I'd turned to for help, the one meant to uphold fairness and basic property rights, hadn't just failed me. It had turned on me. The authority I had trusted had now been weaponized by the very person violating those rules. I wasn't just ignored, I was branded. A problem resident. An aggressor. And I knew right then that any future complaint I made, no matter how justified, would be. Dining table became a command center. Stacks of paper everywhere. Yellow sticky notes marking key pages. Highlighters bleeding through margins like battle scars. It looked like I was preparing for litigation or hosting a deranged book club. But it wasn't madness. It was strategy. The more I read, the more I realized something crucial. Beatrice didn't win because she followed the rules better. She won because she knew which rules people ignored, and she counted on that ignorance. She counted on people not having the patience to dig, not having the energy to challenge her word. But I wasn't most people. Not anymore. I mapped everything. Built a spreadsheet. Cross-referenced every meeting where her name appeared. Tracked her votes, her alliances, her pet projects, even how many times she'd cited community values in board minutes like it was gospel. And slowly, a pattern emerged. A queen with no crown, just a throne built on weaponized bureaucracy. But then came the gem. A sleepy little clause buried in a forgotten appendix of the HOA's electrical safety documentation. You've already heard it. All electrical systems undergo mandatory power cycling during designated maintenance periods. Residential power will be interrupted daily from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the surface. Outdated boilerplate. In practice, the perfect shield. You already know what I did next. A smart timer. Discreet. Compliant. Entirely legal. Power off at 6 p.m. sharp. Back on at dawn. No confrontation. No shouting. Just silence and no free electricity. And when she came over the next night, golf cart cord in hand and plugged in like usual? Nothing. She tried a different outlet. Nothing. She fiddled with the cart. Reset the breaker. Even walked over and looked suspiciously at my garage camera, but this time, she didn't stick out her tongue. For the first time, Beatrice looked confused, and let me tell you, it was beautiful. No bolts to cut, no notes to leave. Just a quiet war of fine print and well-timed circuits. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't escalation. It was compliance with the rules she claimed to love, and it was only the beginning. My dining table transformed into a full-blown war desk, covered in towering stacks of papers, highlighters, legal pads, and HOA documents that looked like the love child of a bar exam and a courtroom drama. Most of the material was as dull and soul-draining as you'd expect. Corporate lingo about maintaining property values and nurturing community harmony, but hidden among the mind-numbing bureaucracy, I began spotting patterns that completely changed the game. What I discovered wasn't just surprising. It was infuriating. Beatrice had mastered the dark art of selective enforcement. She wielded HOA regulations like a sword when it suited her, citing obscure passages on paint colors, lawn lengths, and decibel levels to harass residents she didn't like, but conveniently ignored the sections about respecting private property and getting neighbor consent. The more I read, the clearer it became. She had turned the H.O.A. rulebook into her personal playbook, twisting each rule to suit her whims and moods while skating above the very guidelines she weaponized. But then I stumbled across something buried deep in the maintenance appendix, a single overlooked paragraph in the electrical safety section that made me stop reading and start smiling. It was probably added by a cautious lawyer trying to cover every possible liability. And it read, "All electrical systems undergo mandatory power cycling for safety inspections during designated maintenance periods. Residential power will be interrupted daily from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. during maintenance windows to ensure proper system testing and safety compliance." I read it once, then again, and by the third time, I was grinning like I'd just found gold. To be absolutely clear, there was no actual power cycling happening in our neighborhood. This was just forgotten legal boilerplate, copied and pasted from some ancient policy manual, but for what I had in mind, it was exactly the loophole I needed. Safety compliance, exactly as outlined in the HOA documentation. After all, it was my duty as a concerned and rule-abiding resident to make sure no unauthorized electrical usage occurred on my property during the officially designated maintenance window. And if that just so happened to include unplugging a certain someone's golf cart every single evening at exactly 6 p.m. sharp, well, I was simply following the rules. Beatrice's rules. I ran a few dry rehearsals, just to be sure, waiting for the exact second the digital clock ticked over to 6 p.m. Unplugging the extension cord with a practiced flick, then logging it neatly in my waterproof notebook. 18 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Electrical disconnection completed per HOA Schedule Appendix D, Maintenance Code 7.3.2.1. It was beautiful, impeccable, untouchable. And then the real fun began. The next evening, at exactly 5 hours 59 minutes and 55 seconds p.m., I stood next to the outlet she'd begun using as her personal charging station, stopwatch in hand. As the seconds ticked down, I saw her golf cart already plugged in and happily sucking down free electricity like nothing had ever happened. 5 hours 59 minutes and 58 seconds. 5 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. 6 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Click. I unplugged it, gently, deliberately, and noted the time. Just like the documentation said. By the third day, I noticed something interesting. Her cart was charging for shorter and shorter periods, and she was starting to look annoyed. The smugness that had been practically baked into her expression started to fade, replaced by confusion, and then suspicion. On day 5, I caught her peeking through her blinds, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. I made sure to wave, with the stopwatch and the schedule printout. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't vandalizing. I wasn't making noise. I wasn't even speaking to her. I was following the rules with fanatical politeness. The same rules she had used to justify cutting my lock, mocking my security camera, and stealing my electricity. And the best part? There was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Electrical safety. Compliance in our community was about to become my full-time mission, and I was going to pursue it with a kind of fanatical dedication that any HOA board would have to admire on paper, at least. But in truth, this was about far more than following guidelines. This was me clawing back a sense of control from a situation that had made me feel utterly powerless. Beatrice had built her tyranny on the assumption that most people would fold under pressure, that her targets would eventually get tired, give up, and let her win by sheer exhaustion. But what she hadn't counted on was someone flipping the script and beating her at her own game using the very rulebook she weaponized to turn the tables. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work either. For all I knew, I was about to make a fool of myself in front of someone who thrived on humiliation. But after weeks of feeling cornered, even an outlandish plan felt like progress. As I spread my gear across the porch stopwatch extension cord, Laminated copy of the HOA maintenance schedule, I checked my timing sequence for the final time, nerves buzzing like live wires. The next morning, at precisely 6 a.m., she was going to experience what happened when someone took her beloved rules more seriously than she ever intended. When the first day of my power cycling initiative finally arrived, my heart was hammering by 5:45 a.m., but I stood there like a technician in a lab coat, focused, still, rehearsed. Her golf cart, once again parked at my outlet like it paid rent, looked as smug as ever. I moved like clockwork, every step calculated down to the half second. And then, at 5 hours 59 minutes and 30 seconds, just as I stepped toward the outlet with mechanical calm, she appeared out of nowhere, eyes narrowed and arms crossed, like she'd been lying in wait to bust me mid-act. But that was the beauty of this plan. There was nothing to bust. ChatGPT said. I smiled and held up my laminated copy of the HOA maintenance guidelines like it was the Constitution. Same as yesterday, I said cheerfully. Just doing my part to ensure compliance with the community's electrical safety protocols. I watched her blink slowly, like her brain was short-circuiting. You're cutting off the power to your own outlet. For what? To be petty? I shook my head, letting just the right amount of confusion color my expression. Petty? Oh no. This is about responsibility. According to the HOA's own documentation, power cycling is scheduled between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. for safety inspections. I wouldn't want to be out of compliance. Imagine if there was a fire risk. I made a show of unplugging the extension cord right at 6 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds on the dot. Then I logged the time in my notebook with a precise flick of my pen. Beatrice's jaw clenched. She wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, especially not like this, by someone who wasn't just following the rules, but doing it more aggressively than she ever had. You're enjoying this, she snapped. I'm committed to the safety and integrity of our community, I replied, all wide-eyed innocence. She huffed and turned away, clearly fuming but with no actual violation to point to, because I wasn't breaking any rules. I was doing exactly what the HOA had outlined, something she claimed to cherish above all else. And the best part? I wasn't stopping her from charging her cart. I was giving her 5 seconds. Every time. Just enough to make it infuriating. Just enough to stay perfectly within the lines. And I could tell by the way her shoulders tensed as she walked off that this wasn't over. But that was fine. Because I was just getting started. There. Windows or pausing during their morning walks, curious about the stopwatch guy unplugging a golf cart with military accuracy. Some of them looked confused. A few looked amused. And one or two gave me discreet thumbs up when they thought no one was watching. The truth was, word was spreading. Beatrice wasn't just losing control of the situation, she was losing control of the narrative. What had started as a silent power play behind closed HOA doors was now unfolding in broad daylight, and people were starting to ask quiet questions like, why is he doing that? And more importantly, wait, is he actually breaking any rules? By day 7, the tension in Beatrice's body language had changed. The smug authority she usually wore like armor had started to crack. She'd stopped shouting, stopped arguing. She just stood there silently during my 5-second charge routine, arms folded, mouth tight, rage simmering under the surface with nowhere to go, because I wasn't doing anything wrong, and she knew it. She had created a system designed to intimidate and dominate under the guise of order, and now someone was using that exact same system with such relentless precision that it turned into a mirror. One that showed just how ridiculous and arbitrary her authority really was. And I think, on some level, that was the part that really got to her. Not the loss of convenience, not the fact that I was winning, but the realization that her beloved rules her Tools of control had become the very thing unraveling her hold on this neighborhood, one 5-second plug-in at a time. That final look from Beatrice wasn't just about losing a petty power struggle. It was the expression of someone realizing they were no longer feared, no longer in control, no longer untouchable. And for someone like her, who'd built her entire neighborhood persona on dominance and deference, that kind of realization can be earth-shattering and dangerous. Because you're right, desperate people do desperate things. The moment intimidation stops working, they reach for manipulation. When that fails, they escalate. And if you've backed someone like Beatrice into a corner with nothing left but her pride, she might do something reckless, not out of strategy, but out of spite. You'd already turned the tide of public opinion. You'd taken away her narrative, her credibility, and her power, all without raising your voice or breaking a single rule. But that kind of quiet public humiliation, it doesn't just end things. It breeds obsession. So now the question isn't whether you've won. It's what you do with the loss. Because if Beatrice really is the kind of person who sees boundaries as obstacles and neighbors as pawns, then your mathematical compliance might be the trigger that pushes her to act out in a way that finally crosses a line even she can't manipulate away. So keep your stopwatch. But maybe now, start documenting everything else. 2. And what I found made her formal complaint look like the desperate smokescreen it really was. Buried in years of financial records, mostly scanned PDFs and barely readable spreadsheets, were a handful of strange transactions. Misclassified expenses, vague reimbursement requests, and maintenance contractor payments that didn't match any actual work orders. One entry, marked simply as community enhancement, stood out. It was a $3,200 charge to a landscaping company that didn't even operate in our state. Another involved monthly stipends for consulting services, paid to a firm that shared a mailing address with Beatrice's nephew. I cross-referenced meeting minutes from that same period. No mention of these votes. No discussion. No community approval. So when she shoved that complaint in my hands and declared war, she didn't realize she was walking into one of her own making, because at 7 p.m. sharp, while she was planning to put me on trial in front of the HOA board, I was planning to bring the receipts literally. The real difference between us wasn't that I followed the rules better. It was that I finally understood how she'd been breaking them all along. Her complaint had all the achievements finally understood how she'd been breaking them all along. Her complaint had all the drama of a last-ditch effort. Mine had documentation, timestamps, financial inconsistencies, and highlighted excerpts from the HOA charter. Her power came from perception. Mine came from proof. And after 8 days of countdowns, compliance, and quiet calculation, it was finally time to go from defense to offense. Let her have her meeting. I'd be bringing the agenda. To thank everyone for being here tonight, I finally said, projecting my voice with as much clarity and calm as I could manage. And especially Beatrice for highlighting the importance of compliance and accountability in our community. Because I agree with her completely. We should be holding each other accountable. Which is why I'd like to take a few minutes to go over some concerns I discovered while reviewing the HOA's financial records. Concerns that directly involve our board's use of community funds. The room shifted. The air tightened. Beatrice froze, a fraction too still. I clicked to the first slide on my laptop. A spreadsheet popped onto the projector, crisp and color-coded. This is the expense report from last September, I explained, zooming in. You'll see a $3,200 payment to a landscaping company in Florida. Odd, considering we live in Colorado. A murmur ran through the room. Slide 2. Here's another one. Monthly consulting fees of $450 paid to a Shell LLC registered to it. P.O. Box, which, based on public record searches, appears to be linked to Beatrice's nephew. Slide 3. Meeting minutes. And here's the kicker. None of these expenditures were ever discussed or approved in public HOA meetings as required by our own bylaws. No record, no votes, nothing. Just quiet transactions paid from community funds. By now, the murmur had become open whispers. Someone in the back let out a low, stunned whistle. The board members started looking at each other, unsure whether to check their notes or distance themselves from the blast radius. Clicked once more and brought up a scanned section of the bylaws. I had highlighted the clause in bright yellow. All financial expenditures exceeding $500 must be approved in a public forum with recorded minutes. I looked up. I think the term Beatrice used earlier was weaponizing compliance. Well, I'm happy to comply. I believe in transparency, in process, and in following the rules. That includes the rules about money. The silence that followed was louder than any argument I could have made. Finally, one of the board members, Mr. Reynolds, I think, leaned forward, his face pale. "Ms. Hanover," he said slowly, turning to Beatrice, "can you explain these transactions?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I saw something I never expected from her. Panic. And in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Events and committees, and her authority within the HOA was officially revoked. As the final vote was counted, a wave of applause broke out. Not the kind of polite clapping you get after a boring budget update, but a genuine cathartic burst of collective relief. Neighbors who had never spoken up before were now nodding, smiling, and whispering to each other like a fog had finally lifted. Beatrice, once the untouchable enforcer of neighborhood order, sat frozen in her chair, her face pale, her carefully curated mask of control shattered beyond repair. I stood quietly as the meeting wrapped up, packing up my laptop and documents with the same precision I'd used for my stopwatch routine. I didn't gloat or celebrate. I didn't need to. The truth had done all the talking. What started as a desperate attempt to regain a sliver of dignity in my own garage had ended with the exposure of something much larger, a broken system, manipulated for years, now finally cracked open for everyone to see. As I walked out of that room, I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Peace. Not victory, not vengeance, just the simple satisfaction of knowing I'd stood my ground when it mattered. That cleverness and persistence had finally beaten intimidation and corruption. And the next morning, when 5:59 rolled around, I didn't take out my stopwatch or plug in any cords. I made coffee, opened my garage, and stood quietly watching the sunrise, knowing I'd never have to fight this particular battle again. No mental checklist to run through. Just quiet. Peaceful, uneventful quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, my garage was just a garage again, not a battleground, not a statement, not a stage for some absurd political theater. Just my space, mine alone. Later that morning, I walked out front with a cup of coffee and saw neighbors out for walks, chatting casually like nothing monumental had happened the night before. But I caught a few nods, a few quiet thumbs ups. Someone across the street raised their mug in my direction and smiled. It wasn't applause. It was something better, recognition. Beatrice's golf cart was gone. Her driveway looked unusually bare without it, and it hit me how much quieter the whole block felt without her constant patrolling and passive-aggressive commentary. Like the neighborhood had finally unclenched its jaw. I knew this wouldn't fix everything. HOAs are still bureaucratic beasts, and people like Beatrice always find ways to resurface in new roles, new places. But for now here, the spell was broken. And me? I never plugged her cart in again, Never needed to. I went back to working on my own projects, enjoying my space, and nodding politely at neighbors without worrying who was reporting what to whom. The absurdity of the whole saga still makes me laugh sometimes. All of it, from the bolt cutters to the stopwatch, felt like something out of a very niche comedy series. But I'll say this. If you ever feel powerless against someone who hides behind rules to control others, remember this story. Sometimes, the best way to break their grip isn't to fight harder. It's to play their game better than they ever imagined. With a smile. With receipts. And with a stopwatch dot in her driveway untouched, half covered with a weather tarp that flapped. Little in the breeze, like even it had gone into retirement. The queen of community compliance had become a ghost in her own kingdom. I didn't gloat. I didn't nod or wave or make any smug remarks. I just kept walking. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge, it never really was. It was about proving that the rule she weaponized could cut both ways, and when wielded with just enough creativity, even the most overbearing tyrant could be outmaneuvered with a stopwatch and a straight face. Sometimes, I still think about those mornings. Not with nostalgia, exactly, but with a kind of bemused respect for how absurdly effective the whole operation turned out to be. A 5-second plug-in routine turned into a neighborhood revolution. Not bad for a guy with an extension cord and a grudge. These days, I use the stopwatch for its intended purpose, timing my coffee brew, my morning jogs, the occasional backyard science experiment. And sometimes, when I see the little LCD screen tick over to 5.00 seconds exactly, I smile. Not because I missed the fight, but because I know what those 5 seconds once represented. Precision, persistence, and the quiet power of doing everything. By the book just loudly enough that no one could ignore it. Peace is quiet. Victory is quieter. But a stopwatch? That'll always be loud in the right hand's dot in her driveway. The golf cart now sat untouched under a dusty tarp like some forgotten monument to a toppled regime. She'd clearly found somewhere else to charge it, though I never asked where. Honestly, I didn't care anymore. The entire experience had shown me that the most effective way to deal with a bully isn't always to push back harder. It's to push back smarter, with patience, with creativity. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who once thrived on control slowly lose control of their own narrative. My little 5-second timer routine became something of a neighborhood legend. New residents still hear about it during welcome chats, usually right after they're warned about H.O.A. bylaws, and kids laugh when their parents tell them the story of the man who counted down from 5 every day until the mean lady disappeared. Someone even turned the whole saga into a viral video online. It got millions of views, with comments split between "this guy's a genius" and "these people are completely unhinged," which honestly sounds about right. I never expected to become known for mathematical pettiness and strategic compliance, but stranger things have happened. The story took on a life of its own, becoming this strange symbol of what can happen when someone refuses to be steamrolled by institutional bullying. But the biggest thing I took from it wasn't about precision, timing, or HOA politics. It was about patience, creative problem solving, and what's possible when traditional approaches fail. Beatrice had banked on wearing me down. She thought I'd either give up or lose my temper and look like the bad guy. What she didn't expect was that I'd take her own precious rules and wield them with such surgical accuracy that she'd end up beating herself. Because sometimes winning doesn't mean shouting louder or swinging harder. It means being smarter, quieter, and more stubborn than the person trying to break you. And what I never could have guessed was how many others had been silently enduring her reign of petty control, just waiting for someone to show them it was possible to push back and win. My obsessive documentation and creative persistence hadn't just ended one local feud, it had quietly become a blueprint for others facing their own versions of Beatrice. I started receiving emails from people across the country, asking for advice on how to handle their own HOA tyrants, neighborhood bullies, and petty enforcers of imaginary power. Apparently, there are a lot more Beatrices out there than anyone wants to admit, and not nearly enough people willing to count down from 5 with laser-focused determination until justice shows up. That's equal parts encouraging and depressing. It hit me that my silly little 5-second routine had become something bigger than one man's battle over a power outlet. It had become a strange kind of protest, a symbol of what can happen when quiet resistance meets overreaching authority. Looking back, I don't regret standing up to her. But I do wonder how differently things might have gone if she just knocked on my door that first morning and said, "Hey, my card died during my ride. Do you mind if I plug in for a few minutes?" I would have said, "Sure, no problem. Plug in whenever you need." That single ounce of respect could have saved her everything: her position, her reputation, her illusion of control, and maybe even built a neighborly bond instead of a war. But entitlement cost her far more than electricity. It cost her a place in the community she once ruled. Today, my garage is finally what it was always meant to be: quiet, peaceful, mine. A place where old electronics buzz gently back to life, furniture gets another chance, and no unauthorized golf carts leach energy without asking. The stopwatch still sits on my workbench, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. Not of beating a bully, but of what can be accomplished when you refuse to be bullied in silence. Because sometimes the most effective revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, frustratingly precise, and absolutely, mathematically, annoyingly right. The truth is, bullies like Beatrice count on your exhaustion. They bet you'll eventually give up, not because they're right, but because it's easier than fighting back. They rely on you being reasonable while they refuse to be. What they never expect is someone who gets creative, someone who finds the one strategy they can't argue with, can't twist, and can't overpower because it uses their own rules, their own logic, their own systems against them with surgical precision. And when you fight back like that, not with rage, but with patience, not with drama, but with math, not with confrontation, but with creative compliance, they crumble because their whole foundation was built on no one ever challenging them. That way. That's the story of how a Corinne tried to steal my electricity, and how a 5-second timer routine taught us both something about power. The kind that comes from a wall outlet, and the kind you earn through quiet persistence, clever strategy, and an absolute refusal to back down no matter how loud, entitled, or connected your opponent might be, because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it ticks, 5 seconds at a time, until the ones who thought they were untouchable finally realize no one's watching the clock for them. If this reminded you of someone in your neighborhood, or if you've ever had to get weird, just to hold your ground, drop a comment. I read every single one. This is H.O.A. Stories, and I'll see you in the next mess. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales from the front lines of neighborhood chaos.